Storytime about how I fell in love with my violent stalker. 10 years ago, I moved to Los Angeles. And like so many other people, I moved there because I wanted to become a famous actress. I had saved up $30,000. I found myself a really cute apartment in a good area. 2 weeks after I got to LA, I got my first big agent. 2 days after that, I landed my first big commercial. I would be earning $50,000 for this commercial. It was almost too good to be true. I get a call from my agent letting me know that I had a callback for an audition. After the callback, I was told that I got the part. It was a small part in an indie film. Trust me, nothing you've ever seen. There was this guy that was playing my boyfriend in the movie. Say that he was attractive or hot is a complete understatement. He was a Brad Pitt type. The director had asked us to have lunch together and basically hang out before we even got to set. Without even telling me, this Brad Pitt looking guy shows up to my apartment. He tells me that he's there to pick me up for dinner. I call the director and I say I'm not comfortable with this. And he basically told me that any other girl would be happy to get this part, so that I should just go. But Brad Pitt was acting like we were a couple, holding my hand in the car. You have to go to part 2. Storytime about how I fell in love with my violent stalker. When I got in the car, he was pretending like we were already a couple. At first, I understood. The director of the movie told us to basically act like a couple before we got to set. This was a bit too much. He knew my address and showed up. Clearly, the director gave it to him. And when I get to the car, he's holding my hand. I pull my hand away and he says, "Babe, we talked about this. I love holding your hand in the car." As you can imagine, for the rest of the night, I had to pretend I was a couple with this guy that I had never met before. All because we're playing a couple in a movie. The only time he tried to kiss me was when he said goodbye. That's when I had to break character and say, "This is a bit much, we can stop here." It took 2 weeks to film the movie and finally I was free. I went about my life not thinking anything of it. Until one day, I get a text message from a random number. The text was a description of every part of my body. From my hair to my face to the smell of me, completely freaked me out. I asked who it was and then my doorbell rings. And when I open the door, there's a rose and an envelope. I grab it and lock my door. You're never gonna believe what was in the envelope. Go to part 3. Storytime about I fell in love with my violent stalker. After receiving the rose in the envelope, I open it only to find pictures of me. And I could tell that these were pictures of me taken on set. In my trailer while I was changing, immediately called production and the director of the film. And that's when they tell me that they don't know how that happened and that nobody on set would have done that it must have been a fan or somebody. But how could that be? I was not famous, and there was no way that anybody would know we were filming this movie. I started receiving a rose and an envelope full of pictures of me once a week. Never knew what day or time. I couldn't look out for who it was. I lived in constant fear. There was always a picture of me when I was out, running errands at the supermarket. A couple of months later, I met this guy. He was a quirky comedic actor. He was exactly what I needed in my life. After being together 1 week, I invited him over for dinner. When he knocks on my door, he's beaten and bloody. That's when he tells me that he parked in my garage and a man popped out and started hitting him. We went to the cops, but there were no cameras in my parking garage, but we never saw his face. And of course, he broke up with me right then and there. And it gets worse. Part 4 is up. Storytime about how I fell in love with my violent stalker. After my boyfriend was beaten to a pulp, he broke up with me. I was completely devastated. I was still scared all the time because I knew that I was getting a rose with all those pictures of me. From the first rose, it had been 3 years. I was getting hang-up calls, knocks on my door at 4 in the morning. Can you imagine that happening to you? One day I go to the supermarket and I feel somebody standing behind me. It's the Brad Pitt looking guy from the movie I had done years before. He invites me out to lunch and I accept. Weeks pass by and we hang out every single day. Before I know it, I'm in love. Got along super great and the chemistry was amazing. Until one day he asks me, "Do you like the roses I send you?" I thought he was joking. Then he confesses that he had been the one to send me the roses. That all this time he's been taking care of me. I broke up with him, left my apartment and moved back home. It's been 10 years and he still sends me roses. What should I do? Imagine having a mother-in-law from hell. You're on vacation with your best friend and you meet a man. He's handsome and very, very funny. And the best part is you both happen to live in the same city. You begin to date. For the first time, you experience a healthy relationship. He's considerate, loving, he dotes over you. He's a provider and a caretaker. He talks to you about his family and how close he is to his mom. When his dad passed away, he decided to move back in with his mom to help take care of her. Could he be any more perfect? After 2 months of dating, he asks you to come meet his mom, and they live in a very big, beautiful house. She makes an elaborate dinner, and she's even made some of your favorite foods. And you think, what a warm welcome. The conversation is easy and fluid, but you can tell she's very traditional. When you ask for that second glass of wine, she suggests you only have one, and you want to be on your best behavior, so you accept. And suddenly you feel you're being judged. She's looking at you different. But that's normal, right? Go to part. Imagine having a mother-in-law from hell. You see, when you met your husband on vacation, he was perfect, handsome, loving, considerate, and very, very funny. He talked to you about his mom. After his dad passed away, he decided to move back in with his mom. She has a tendency to become very depressed. And you couldn't help but think, gosh, he's such a good person. You happen to both live in the same city. You begin to date, and after 2 months, he insists that you meet his mom. And you just know it in your heart that he's going to be proposing soon. So you accept. You show up to an unexpectedly big and beautiful house. Your future mother-in-law greets you with a smile on her face and beautiful diamonds on her neck. And you happen to both love fashion, so you connect right away when you compliment her on her beautiful Chanel. And she's cooked an elaborate dinner, something really special. She asks about your lineage, but you don't come from a well-off family. You tell her you work for everything you have and you own your own business, but she's not impressed. When you reach for that second glass of wine, she says, a drunk woman is very unattractive. Go to part 2. Imagine you have a mother-in-law from hell. She hates that you come from a poor family. In an effort to get her to know you better, you invite her out to lunch. Just you and her. And the first thing she says to you is, she enjoys your creativity when it comes to fashion. She never would have thought to wear an orange blouse and green trousers, but that's just her. And she judges every single plate of food that comes out, eventually saying that she will be the one to pick the restaurant next time and the cherry on top. When she tells you that her son has many women after him, and that they are all beautiful, all rich, but that for some reason he's chosen you. So she suggests that you keep a close eye on him. You tell her that you trust him. Out of nowhere, she says, I know for a fact he's talking to girls. He's planning something behind your back. Might be proposing. You know she said this only to ruin the surprise. How could she? And she was right. 2 days later, you show up to his house. It's covered in pink roses. He proposes outside. And when you walk in, your entire family and friends are there. And your mother-in-law? Well, she's crying. Part 3 is, imagine you have a mother-in-law from hell. She's already spoiled the surprise of your engagement, and she spent the next 3 days crying in her room. Your fiance tells you she's just emotional because she wishes her husband was still alive. Fast forward 6 months after the wedding, you find out you're pregnant, and everyone is so happy. She begins to cook every single one of your meals, and at first you feel so grateful, and then you begin to feel sick. You feel dizzy, almost drunk, and she tells you that's normal. You tell your husband you want to go to the doctor, but she insists that you don't. After a week, you can't take it anymore. Doctors run some tests and ask you if you've taken any chemicals. And of course you say no. But your husband starts investigating. Your husband finds an unlabeled bottle in the kitchen, and when confronted, your mother-in-law denies that it was hers. You are both afraid for the life of your child. You're both convinced your mother-in-law was poisoning you. She still denies it. The baby is born healthy. Are you letting her see the baby? Or are you getting revenge? What would you do? Storytime about how I texted all the women in my boyfriend's phone to tell them that I was pregnant with his child. My boyfriend has a lot of female friends. In fact, that's how our relationship started out. We're both dancers and we met at the same dance conservatory. This means we are constantly surrounded by people our age who are always trying to go out and have fun. I moved to New York City in the hopes of becoming a rockette. This meant I was completely devoted to dancing. In my world, there's nothing but dancing and working out. So the moment I met my now boyfriend, I was smitten. When he comes into the room, people gravitate towards him, especially the girls. Because yes, he is attractive and he's a dancer, so you can imagine what his body looks like. He's graceful but masculine. He's sensitive but strong. Before he and I ever talked, I just assumed he was a huge player. He was always with a new girl every single day. And I don't mean like with her, just like talking to her, walking to classes. But everything changed the moment we were partnered. Our dance teacher stopped the class, only to have everyone watch us dance for the next 40 minutes. He said that our bodies were made for each other. And after that class, he would not leave me alone. He chased me for about 3 months. You're never gonna guess what happens. Part 2 is a storytime about how I texted all the women in my boyfriend's phone and told him that I was pregnant with his child. After he began chasing me for 2 months, I felt like the luckiest girl in the world. Every single girl in our conservatory wanted to be with him, but he was chasing me. The best part is, our teacher paired us up for the rest of the semester. This meant that we had to dance together every single day, go to rehearsals together. Like I said in part 1, in my world, there was only dancing and working out. I did not have time for a relationship, but against my better judgment, I decided to say yes. From one day to the next, our relationship was as serious as it could possibly get. It felt like I wasn't ready for it, but I wanted to be. We were together all day long, dancing together, going to get lunch, rehearsing, and he even switched over to my gym and we would work out together. And magically, all the girls went away. There weren't any girls chasing him anymore. And for a moment in time, everyone wanted to be with us. I even started getting more attention from boys than I did before. But one day, I see messages coming into his phone. The jealousy I felt in my body, I swear to God, it was poisoning me. And when I asked him who it was, he said it was just a dancer from school. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I texted all the women in my boyfriend's phone to let them know that I was pregnant with his child. When I saw that message come through, the jealousy I felt was poisoning my body. I asked him and he said it was just one of the girls from school. And after this, I actually could not sleep. I felt nauseous and sick. And without even thinking about it, it was 3 a.m. I grabbed his phone and I texted all the women in his phone. Every single one. And all I said was, stop trying to text me or contact me. I'm having a baby. And then I stayed awake for another 2 hours hoping that they would text me back so I could delete everything. I texted 70-something girls. That's how many girls he had saved in his phone. And then the most horrendous thing, they were not happy. From the responses, so many were like in love with him. A few of them were begging him to leave me, saying things like the baby wasn't his and that I wasn't good enough for him. Right before I fell asleep, another message came in. One of the girls saying, it doesn't matter, I'll still see you tomorrow. Come to find out he had still been hooking up with girls. But he got upset when I told him that I texted everybody, so I told him that I would forgive him his sins if he forgave me mine. I know this is toxic, but I can't let go of this relationship. He's everything I've ever wanted. Am I taking things too far?
Storytime about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. Tell you that last month I made $60,000. It's clear this is not my story time and send me on Instagram. So at the beginning I had to lie about my age. I'm really 36 years old, but I say I'm 22. I do look a lot younger than I am, and of course I get filler and Botox. I started my Instagram account 6 years ago. My inspirations were Anna Cherie, Amanda Lee, Sam Jojo, and Abigail Ratchford. I mean Abigail Ratchet. I basically copied all of these girls' pictures. Within a month of starting my Instagram account, I had 10,000 followers. And yes, all of them were males. But I didn't really start making money until 2018. You know, like every other girl on Instagram, I signed up for OF. And that's when I started making serious money. But I was also making money from Instagram. Brands would send me clothes and watches and protein powders, stuff like that. Eventually, I became an ambassador for one of the biggest Instagram clothing stores. I think we all know what I'm talking about. Fashion Hova, and I started making a lot of money then. So I basically started living above my means. I got myself a new apartment in Beverly Hills, and it was $6,000 a month. I also got myself a Mercedes, and I would exclusively shop at Air One. I would also go shopping at Rodeo Drive almost every day because I wanted the paparazzi to get pictures of me. And I even called the paparazzi on me a few times, so I had to pay them like $2,000 out of pocket. So yeah, I was spending a lot of money. Whatever money I got that month, I would literally spend it by the end. One month I spent $25,000 going out with friends. I would usually pick up the bill. This is what started getting me into trouble. Part 2 is Storytime about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. After I spent the $25,000 in 1 month, I decided I needed another income source. So I thought of escorting. One of my very good friends in LA was also an escort, and she told me about it, but I was like, I can't do that. But one day I called her and she told me everything. She gets contacted through Instagram by very, very rich men, like billionaires. I honestly didn't believe her at first, but then she showed me receipts. Her bank account had more than $1 million in it. She told me that she had only been doing it for 6 months. She put me in contact with several people and they had to verify a bunch of my stuff. But then after a week, I was finally in. I was really scared. I had to go get my passport renewed. This meant that I was going to be traveling internationally with men that I didn't know. A few days later, I get a message on Instagram from an account. The guy that owned this account was clearly very rich. It wasn't him contacting me, it was his assistant. He got my information and 2 days later, I was on a private plane. I landed in a foreign country and I spent the entire weekend with this guy. He didn't speak English. Basically took me around his city and showed me off for his friends. I honestly didn't feel uncomfortable at any point and he didn't try anything. In fact, he was actually super shy, but his friends on the other hand were really handsy. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I became an Instagram model / escort for billionaires. That's when his friends started getting really handsy. We were in a really expensive high-rise and the apartment was literally worth millions. And I knew that all of these guys were used to getting whatever they wanted. One of the friends actually grabbed my arm and told me to sit on his lap, but I told him I couldn't. He wasn't the one that hired me to be there, so I had to go straight to the guy that hired me. I told him that his friends were making me uncomfortable and he said, okay, we should leave then. I was actually shocked that he listened to what I wanted. Now one of my regular clients and I travel with him almost every 2 months. So let me tell you how much he paid me. For the 3-day weekend, I ended up with $50,000. Yep, that's right. But let me tell you a little about the dark side of this. A few jobs later, I ended up with somebody who was completely crazy. I ended up going to Vegas with this guy. He was approximately 10 years younger than me and was filthy rich. But he was also a complete psycho. He bought me this whole outfit that he wanted me to wear the entire night. I told him I was more comfortable in my clothes. I was wearing a Fendi dress. It looked great. That's when he said, no, you're gonna wear this. I ended up walking around Vegas in a micro mini skirt and a bikini top. By the end of this night, he was getting really aggressive. I tried to stay quiet, hoping that he would just forget that I was in his car. Suddenly, he turned to look at me and wanted me to do something. When I said no, he grabbed me by the hair and told me that he owned me for the night. Then he said, I'll add an extra $20,000 in there for you. And it does get worse. But now I learned to save my money. I no longer pay pay for my friends' drinks and food. I still have my $6,000 apartment, and I upgraded my car. I live like a princess. I also bought my parents a house though. It was definitely one of the happiest days of my life. And believe it or not, I actually did end up finding love. My boyfriend is okay with my job, but he just asked me to be safe. Of course, he asked me every day to quit because he wants to support me, but he can't give me the life I've given myself. What should I do? Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. I'm 24 years old and my boyfriend is 21. According to him, he has never been with any girl who's had cellulite before, or even an ounce of body fat. Yes, I know what you're thinking, he's a total asshole, which in that sense, he is. But the rest of the time, he's completely fine and actually sweet. We met last year at a friend's party. At the party, I instantly fell in love with him. I thought he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And it was reciprocated. I saw him from across the room and he made eye contact. A few minutes later, he walked over to me and just struck up a conversation. I know that people present themselves the way they want to be seen, especially when they're trying to impress someone they're attracted to. He started telling me about how he's studying to be a doctor, how he volunteers at animal shelters, and that every single weekend he also volunteers at the soup kitchen. Everything he said was absolutely perfect. By the end of the night, he had asked me out on a date and I said yes. I did explain to him that I didn't want anything serious and he said that was totally fine. I was trying to focus on my studies, so having a boyfriend was not in my plans. But after we went on 7 dates, he asked me to be his girlfriend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. After about a month, I finally said yes. Mind you, at this point, he hadn't seen me naked, not even in a bathing suit. The very night that I said yes to being his girlfriend, he asked me to come over to his place. He made a whole gourmet dinner, even bought super expensive wine. So we ended up doing it for the first time that night. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing he said to me was, "Do you ever exercise?" I was shocked. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimers are not my story time, I sent me on Instagram. That's when he said point blank, super serious, "Do you ever exercise?" I just stared at him. I had literally just woken up in his bed after the first time we ever did it. Then I thought he must be joking. So I started to laugh a little, and then he says, "No, seriously, do you ever exercise?" I said, "Sometimes." Then he told me, "You should really try to work out at least 5 times a week." I went home and finally texted him saying that I wasn't comfortable with the way he spoke to me. That's when he said that what he said to me was completely normal, and that I shouldn't be offended. This was all in text, by the way. That's when he sends me another text message saying, "You know, you wouldn't have as much cellulite as you do if you didn't eat so much fast food. And if you exercise 5 times a week like I told you." I didn't reply to him for the rest of the day. Later that day, he shows up to my apartment and says, "You know, I should feel comfortable enough to tell you what I think about you." He somehow ended up making me feel bad and I ended up apologizing. Obviously, after that, I became really self-conscious about my cellulite and my entire body. So anytime we were together, I would always stay under the covers. By the way, my boyfriend doesn't have a great body. He's super soft and pudgy. Last week, he told me that he had abs though. Part 3 is story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. One day, he pulls up his shirt and says, "Look, I have abs." Which, no, he doesn't. He's super soft and has a thick layer of fat on it. I smirked and he said, "What?" And I said, "You don't have abs." Then he says, "Yes, I do. I'm in better shape than you." By the way, he said this in front of his friends, so I was super embarrassed and stayed quiet the entire day. He finally went to drop me off and I was so happy to be home. But he decided to come upstairs with me. Got straight into my PJs. And when I came out of my bedroom, he says, "Wow, your cellulite's getting worse by the day." That's when I finally broke. I turned around and started yelling at him. I told him he had no right to talk about my body the way that he did, and that all he does is objectify me. He started laughing and said, "Wow, those are big words." And that when we met, he thought that I was in better shape. My clothes obviously tricked him. I'm 5'4" and I weigh 130 pounds. I am by no means fat, but the way that he was bullying me was making me think that I was. That's when I told him that he was the fat one, and that he had a big, huge beer belly. I also told him that his face was super round, but that didn't bother me. Oh yeah, and that his hairy back was gross. Then he said, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking my physical appearance." Then he stormed out of my apartment, and as soon as he left, I felt happy. We haven't spoken in 4 days. I'm afraid that if he asks me to get back with him, I will. But I should just break up with him, right? What should I do? Story time about how a strange man abused me because I did not want to give him my phone number. Disclaimer, is not my story time, I sent him on Instagram. That's when he slid his hand onto my lap. I quickly get up from the table and ask him to leave. That's when he said, "Why are you freaking out? I'm just trying to get your number." Then I told him that there was absolutely 0 chance I would ever give him my phone number. And he said, "Oh, you think you have a choice?" And he holds out his phone so that I could type in my number. I pushed his phone back and again asked him to leave. He threatened me and said that he wouldn't leave until I gave him my number. My knees and hands were shaking. Look back at my employees behind the counter and they are scared. That's when one of my employees says, "I'm gonna call the cops." And I said, "Yes, call them." As soon as I turned back to this man, he swings at me. He wasn't able to reach my face, but then he grabbed me by the shoulders and pushed me down onto the ground. This all happened in about 30 seconds. As I'm on the ground, he starts slapping me. I covered my face with my arms and I just started kicking at him. And my 2 female employees, who by the way are like 17 and 18, start attacking the guy. And then he starts hitting them. Thankfully, 2 men from the street hear me yelling. I came in and tackled him and the police arrived 2 minutes later. I found out this guy was stalking me for a month. I got a restraining order. Be careful. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, send me on Instagram. I come from a really big family. My mom has 5 sisters and 1 brother, and my dad has has 4 brothers and sisters. All of them have their own kids, so I have a lot of cousins. And this means we have a lot of family get-togethers. Every single weekend, someone is hosting a party. We all get together and eat, and it's actually a really nice time. But there's always that one creepy uncle. In my case, it's my mom's brother. He's 46-year-old and has never married, but he's a bachelor. He's got money, so he basically has a bunch of sugar babies. Whenever my family tells him that he needs to get married, he says he'll never get married to anybody. He thinks women only exist for the pleasure of men. When I turned 16, I noticed that he would stare at me a lot. At first, it was just staring. Every now and again, he never did anything really creepy then, but just the staring was enough for me. I never told my mom about it then, not until I turned 18. This is when he started making comments like, wow, you're growing into your body, or wow, you got great hips. He would make comments about how I was growing up, like, ew. He even told my dad that he needed to keep me away from guys because I was growing up really quickly. And because of my curves, men would think that I was a woman. This is when I finally told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable. She thought it was funny at first, so I avoided him at all costs. Part 2. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's me on Instagram. When I told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable, she laughed it off. She thought it was funny. She said, oh, you know how he is. So from that point on, I basically avoided my uncle every time we were at a family event. When I turned 20, this is when things got even worse. He would ask me things like if I was a virgin, or if I had a boyfriend, if I had ever been on dates. And one time he even told me that he would get very jealous if I ended up bringing a guy to one of our family events. One time he complimented me on the dress that I was wearing, so after that, I only wore baggy clothes to family events. The fact that I had to change the way that I dress so that he could control himself makes me sick. I finally told my mom again that my uncle was always bothering me. It's when she told me that the world is filled with men like him, and that all I needed to do was just ignore him. So I told my dad everything. My dad took it a little more seriously and told my uncle that he needed to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed. Part 3 is up.
Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, is not my story time, it's me on Instagram. I'm 24 years old and my boyfriend is 21. According to him, he has never been with any girl who's had cellulite before, or even an ounce of body fat. Yes, I know what you're thinking, he's a total asshole, which in that sense, he is. But the rest of the time, he's completely fine and actually sweet. We met last year at a friend's party. At the party, I instantly fell in love with him. I thought he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And it was reciprocated. I saw him from across the room and he made eye contact. A few minutes later, he walked over to me and just struck up a conversation. I know that people present themselves the way they want to be seen, especially when they're trying to impress someone they're attracted to. He started telling me about how he's studying to be a doctor, how he volunteers at animal shelters, and that every single weekend he also volunteers at the soup kitchen. Everything he said was absolutely perfect. By the end of the night, he had asked me out on a date and I said yes. I did explain to him that I didn't want anything serious and he said that was totally fine. I was trying to focus on my studies, so having a boyfriend was not in my plans. But after we went on 7 dates, he asked me to be his girlfriend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. After about a month, I finally said yes. Mind you, at this point, he hadn't seen me naked, not even in a bathing suit. The very night that I said yes to being his girlfriend, he asked me to come over to his place. He made a whole gourmet dinner. Story time about how my grandma got married when she was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's me on Instagram. So just picture it. I'm sitting with my 94-year-old grandma in the kitchen, and suddenly she starts talking about my grandpa. My grandpa passed away almost 10 years ago. And to be fair, they did have a wonderful marriage. By all accounts, and by all of my family's accounts, they were totally in love until the moment he took his last breath. Here's how the story goes. The first time they met, she was 12 years old. He had just gotten back from the war. She was walking home from school with her backpack, and my 27-year-old grandpa pulls up in his car. He starts to tell her that she's going to be his future wife, and that he's going to talk to her parents so that they can get married. He kept inviting her into his car, but she kept saying no. He followed her home from school every single day. As my grandma is telling the story, everyone is laughing, except for me. Finally, one day he followed her to her house, knocked on the door, and requested to speak to my great-grandfather. They spoke for an hour, and that's when my great-grandpa promised my grandma to my grandpa, and he gave them permission to get married when she was 14. At first, he wanted them to get to know each other, so they started going on dates. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's on Instagram. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. This is when my great-grandfather promised my 12-year-old grandma to my 27-year-old grandfather. My great-grandpa thought that it would be best they wait 2 years so that they can get married when she's 14. In the meantime, he suggested that they start going out on dates. Yes, a 12-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man. By the way, as my grandma is telling this story, all of my cousins are laughing at this. I'm trembling in my seat. She explained to us that for those 2 years, my grandfather was on his best behavior, and that essentially they read books together, they walked together by the lake, and he would take her out to see movies. She said at the time it was a big deal. Going to the movies was like a big treat. I guess it made me feel better knowing that he didn't try to do anything to her at the time. Still, it's absolutely disgusting. Finally, the 2 years passed, and at this point, they're totally in love. They get married. Both their families attended this wedding. How did no one in their families think it was inappropriate? Watching a 14-year-old get married to a 29-year-old man? But it gets worse. Part 3 is up.
Story time about my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14 years old and he was 29. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. This is the third and last part. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. 2 years pass and they get married. My grandma even told us that the night of their wedding, my great-grandparents gifted them a night at a hotel so that they could have some privacy. You can imagine what happened. My grandmother described it as the most liberating night of her life. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Their first baby was born right before she turned 15, and then she got pregnant again at 15, and then at 17, and then at 18, 19, and finally 20. My grandfather got into oil in his late 20s. He made about $1 million by the time he was 35, so he was able to give them a very comfortable life. He purchased a manor. They had 3 housekeepers, 1 butler, and 4 nannies, and they had a really happy life. My grandma says my grandpa was always affectionate with her, and she said they blessed their bed every single night. After she finishes telling the story, all of my cousins laugh and think it's cute. I was disturbed. I asked her why it was okay to get married at such a young age. And then I said, would you have wanted me to get married when I was 14? That's when she said that times were just different back then. The war was happening, and people didn't know if they would live or die. She also said that when a catch like my grandfather turned up, most parents were looking for a man like my grandfather to marry off their daughters. Grandpa was educated, handsome, driven, had great work ethic, and he took care of her, which is what he promised my great-grandpa. And then when the children came, he more than took care of them. He even took care of my great-grandparents too. He ended up moving them into the manor in their old age, and they were fully taken care of by the staff. Apparently, the manor was big enough to fit in 4 families. Now, I loved my grandfather. He was a great, kind man, and I myself benefited off the generational wealth. He paid for my education, and I'm now a lawyer for it. But still, a huge part of me feels absolutely disgusted with the history of their love. Even though back then that might have been normal, I think it's horrendous. Yes, they had a great love story, but she was a child. Apparently, this was a big family secret. None of the uncles or my parents wanted us to know. I got into a huge argument with my parents for hiding this from me. They think I'm totally overreacting. Am I, though? I guess I'll need more therapy. What do you think? Story time about how I married a married man. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent me on Instagram. Years ago, I met this guy that I thought was really cute. Stupid and naive, and I believed everything he said. I worked in customer service. He came into my job one day and just started flirting with me, and I was like thrilled. My job was really boring. This cute guy comes in and just starts talking to me, and I just fall in love. I'm not exaggerating. I know it's pathetic. I couldn't believe that he was talking to me and that he was interested in me. The next day, he asked me for my phone number, and I gave it to him. I went on one date, and I was legit in love. It starts to get creepy. He was 20 years older than me, and you could say he GROOMED'd me. See, I didn't know what was happening. I was 19, I had never had a boyfriend, and I barely had ever been kissed. Played me like a fiddle. After 2 weeks of going on dates, he finally kissed me. I knew that he was the man I wanted to marry. But when I told my coworker about him, she told me that he was married. I asked him about it. He told me that my coworker must have been mistaking him for his brother, because his brother and him had similar names and the brother was married. 2 days later, I asked one of his friends about it. That's when his friend tells me that he doesn't even have a brother, and that he had been married for 15 years to a girl that was also 20 years younger than him. Even knowing this, I still married him. And you'll never guess how. Part 2 is already up. Story time about how I married a guy who was already married. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's gonna be on Instagram. Even though I knew he was already married to somebody else, and even though I knew he lied to me about already being married, I still went ahead and married him. I was completely obsessed with him. Because he was already legally married to somebody else, we decided to use a different name for him, and somehow it worked. We actually drove 5 hours away to get married, used fake names, filed in a different state, and then we drove back to our hometown, where literally no one knew we were married. It was our little secret. But then the poo hit the fan. He kept promising that he would leave his wife. But one day, I'm having dinner with my parents at a restaurant, and guess who shows up? My husband with his wife. And boy, did they look happy. He was all over her, kissing her neck and her hands. Not only until he realized that I was in the restaurant did he stop. Then he actually had the audacity to come to my table, introduce himself to my parents, and tell him that he knew me from my job. All the while his wife was sitting at the table looking at me. And in that moment, I knew that she knew something was up. It's like she stared straight into my soul. She must have seen the way that I was looking at him, because she ran up to the table and introduced herself to me and my parents. When she tried to shake my hand, I didn't shake it back. My parents told me I was being rude, so I forced myself to shake her hand. 2 days later, she calls me and asks me what's up. But I lied and said that her husband was just a friend. Then I got an idea. I decided to be her friend. I asked her out to coffee and we had a great time. And little did she know that she was sitting with her husband's new wife. I feel like this way I can try to control their relationship from the inside. I confessed everything to my mom and she thinks I'm crazy. I think I'm a little crazy too. Am I completely wrong for this?